Good evening. Allow me to introduce you to a tale, a charming little love story, if you will. A story of roses, chocolates, and gunfire. Yes, on this day, dedicated to romance, I invite you to peek behind the veil of a dark and dreadful massacre. A day when Cupid traded his bow for a Tommy gun. So please, settle in and prepare yourself for our little tale. But be warned, by the end of it, you might find yourself rethinking the meaning of love to death. Chicago, 1929. A city of contradictions. On the surface, it was a gleaming metropolis of industry and opportunity, where jazz clubs thrummed with life and speakeasies buzzed with forbidden pleasures. But beneath the glittering facade lurked a darker, bloodier reality. It was a city divided by crime, where the law was bent, or outright broken, by those who held the real power. The streets belonged to men like Al Capone, the self-styled kingpin of the South Side, who controlled not just the flow of bootleg liquor, but the hearts and minds of the desperate masses who lived in his shadow. Capone was a paradox. To some, he was a benevolent benefactor, doling out turkeys at Christmas and cash to struggling families. To others, he was a tyrant, a monster who enforced his rule with bullets and brutality. Across the city, George Bugs Moran held sway over the north side. Moran was as ruthless as Capone, but cut from a different cloth. Where Capone was brash and calculating, Moran was fiery and reckless, a man who thrived on chaos. The feud between them was more than a business rivalry. It was a vendetta, fueled by betrayals, ambushes, and the constant threat of annihilation. The Prohibition era was their battleground, and liquor was their weapon. With alcohol outlawed, an insatiable demand arose, one that men like Capone and Moran were only too eager to satisfy. Smugglers, distillers, and enforcers worked in the shadows, ensuring the city's thirst was quenched. The police, either outgunned or on the payroll, turned a blind eye. Justice was a rare commodity in a city where power was bought and life was cheap. On the south side, Capone's headquarters, the Lexington Hotel, was a fortress. Armed guards patrolled its halls, and every visitor was scrutinized. Capone himself was often seen in his tailored suits and diamond rings, a picture of opulence that belied the blood on his hands. On the north side, Moran operated from a different kind of headquarters, a nondescript office above a grocery store. It was a far cry from Capone's lavish setup. But Moran was not a man concerned with appearances. His focus was on survival, expansion, and revenge. The tension between the two gangs was palpable, a city-wide powder keg waiting for a spark. Each new ambush or assassination ratcheted the violence to new heights. Speakeasies were firebombed, trucks full of liquor hijacked, and bodies left in alleys as grim reminders of the stakes. But there was something different about February of 1929. A chill hung over the city that went beyond the winter wind. Rumors swirled of an impending move by Capone, something bold and decisive. Moran, no stranger to danger, increased his security, surrounding himself with trusted men. Yet even he couldn't have foreseen what was coming. For in the underworld of Chicago, where allegiances were fragile and betrayal was as common as rain, the most dangerous enemy wasn't always the one in front of you. Sometimes it was the one who smiled, shook your hand, and promised you a deal too good to refuse. And so, the stage was set. The players moved into position. The story of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre wasn't just about bullets and bloodshed. It was about power, greed, and the lengths men would go to protect their empires. Capone, ever the meticulous puppeteer, was far away in Florida, ensuring his alibi was airtight. But his men were busy in Chicago, arranging a trap. A fake deal to sell stolen liquor lured Moran's men to the garage. The plan was precise. 4 men, 2 dressed as police officers, would storm the garage. The uniforms were not only a ruse, but also a cruel irony. Justice itself would appear to slaughter the sinners. As Moran's men smoked and joked, the 2 officers entered, barking commands. Believing it was a routine raid, the men complied. They lined up against the wall, backs to their executioners. Then, officers signaled their accomplices. Guns roared, tearing the air apart. The massacre was over in seconds, but the horror lingered. 7 bodies lay crumpled, riddled with bullets, their blood painting the garage walls. The scene was a grotesque tableau, a testament to the cruelty of men and the hunger for power. But one detail was eerier still. One of the victims, Frank Gusenberg, clung to life. When the real police arrived, they asked who had shot him. Gusenberg, defiant even in death, rasped his reply, "Nobody shot me." A lie to the very end, perhaps an echo of the code these men lived and died by. The garage on North Clark Street didn't remain silent for long after the massacre. Though the blood had been scrubbed from the walls and the bodies taken away, the air in that small, nondescript building seemed to hum with the echoes of violence. What had once been a hidden hub for deals and deliveries became an infamous landmark, a place where death had left its mark. Not just on the concrete, but on the very fabric of reality. At first, the stories came from those who lived nearby. Residents of the Lincoln Park neighborhood began to notice strange occurrences. Late at night, the quiet streets were disturbed by phantom sounds, the distant clatter of machine guns, the muffled shouts of men, and the bone-chilling noise of heavy bodies hitting the ground. Those who dared to pass the garage after dark claimed they could feel a weight in the air, an oppressive presence that seemed to press down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. One woman, who lived in an apartment overlooking the site, told a local reporter about the strange, shadowy figures she would see in the alley behind the garage. "They looked like men in hats and overcoats," she said, "but their faces, they weren't right. They were hollow, almost blurry, like they weren't fully there." The reporter dismissed her account as hysteria, but others in the neighborhood began to echo her claims. The most chilling tales came from those who entered the garage itself. Shortly after the massacre, the building changed hands several times, each new owner hoping to erase the site's grisly history and turn it into a profitable space. A mechanic rented the garage to run a small auto repair business, but he abandoned it only after a few months. His reasoning? The voices. "They'd start around sunset," he explained to a friend, "low at first, like someone whispering just out of earshot. But then they'd get louder. You could hear them arguing, yelling even. But when you'd go to check, there was no one there." The mechanic wasn't the only one to flee. A group of bootleggers who briefly used the garage for storage reported hearing footsteps echoing in the empty space at all hours of the night. Tools would vanish, only to reappear in strange places. One man swore he saw a figure in a blood-stained suit staring at him from the corner of the room, its eyes sunken and accusing. Over time, the garage became a magnet for thrill seekers and ghost hunters, drawn by its dark reputation. Some claimed to capture evidence of the paranormal, photographs of the strange, misty figures, audio recordings of faint voices and gunfire, and sudden, unexplained cold spots that sent shivers down their spines. In 1949, a reporter from a local newspaper decided to spend the night in the garage, determined to debunk the ghost stories. Armed with a camera, a notebook, and a flask of whiskey to keep his nerves steady, he settled in for what he thought would be an uneventful night. But when morning came, he emerged pale and trembling, his flask untouched. He refused to speak of what he'd experienced, except to say, "They're still there. All of them." One of the most infamous accounts came from a young man who claimed to see the massacre play itself like a macabre film. While peering through a window late one night, he saw the garage filled with men in fedoras and long coats, their faces tense as they lined up against the wall. He watched, frozen in horror, as 2 men in police uniforms burst in, followed by plainclothes gunmen. The deafening sound of gunfire rang out, and the figures crumpled to the ground. But when the young man blinked, the garage was empty once more. Even after the garage was demolished in 1967, the hauntings didn't cease. The site became a parking lot, but visitors reported feeling an eerie chill whenever they walked over the spot where the wall once stood. Dogs would bark and growl at nothing, refusing to cross the area. Some claimed to hear the faint sound of men's voices murmuring in the wind, as if their restless spirits were still trapped there, reliving their final moments over and over. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had left an indelible scar on Chicago's history. But for those who believed in ghosts, it was more than a memory. It was a haunting, chilling reminder that violence has a way of lingering. It echoes, refusing to fade. The ghosts of the North Clark Street garage were not content to be forgotten, and their presence served as a warning. The past is never truly dead, and some wounds never fully heal. Al Capone was a man accustomed to having control, a puppet master pulling the strings of Chicago's underworld. But control is a fleeting thing, especially when it's built on blood. After the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Capone solidified his dominance over the city. Bugs Moran's North Side gang was broken, its power shattered. Yet for all his success, Capone would soon find himself haunted. Not by the law, but by something much darker. By the early 1930s, Capone's empire began to crumble under the weight of federal scrutiny. The FBI, frustrated by their inability to pin murders on him, focused on his financial crimes instead. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. It was a bitter pill for a man who had once ruled Chicago like a king, and the reality of his downfall began to eat away at him. Capone was first sent to the federal prison in Atlanta, but his reputation followed him. Even behind bars, his wealth and influence afforded him certain luxuries, and he attempted to maintain an air of authority among the inmates. However, whispers began circulating about Capone's growing paranoia. Fellow prisoners noticed that he often avoided certain areas of the prison, muttering under his breath about them. Things took a darker turn when Capone was transferred to Alcatraz in 1934. Known as The Rock, Alcatraz was an unforgiving place, designed to crush even the most hardened criminals. Cut off from all his allies and surrounded by cold walls and colder men, Capone's mind began to unravel. It wasn't long before he started complaining about being followed, not by the guards or his fellow inmates, but by shadows. "He won't leave me alone," Capone told a cellmate one night, his voice trembling. When asked who he meant, Capone refused to answer, but his eyes darted to the dark corners of the cell. Over time, the stories became more specific. Capone claimed to see men in fedoras standing just outside the bars of his cell, staring at him in silence. Sometimes they would whisper, their voices low and accusatory, though he could never make out what they were saying. One name came up more than others: James Clark, one of the 7 men killed in the massacre. Capone swore he saw Clark's bloodied face pressed against the bars of his cell at night, his hollow eyes filled with rage. "He's coming for me," Capone would mumble to himself, pacing his cell like a caged animal. It wasn't just Capone who noticed strange things. Guards reported hearing him talking to someone late at night, though his cell was empty. When asked who he was speaking to, Capone would only shake his head, his face pale and drawn. On several occasions, Capone woke up screaming, claiming that unseen hands were gripping his throat or pulling at his sheets. Inmates began to avoid him, unnerved by his erratic behavior and growing sense that something unnatural surrounded him. One man, a hardened killer himself, claimed he saw a shadowy figure standing over Capone as he slept, its shape distorted and wrong, like something out of a nightmare. Capone's decline wasn't just mental. While at Alcatraz, he began to suffer from syphilis, a condition he had contracted years earlier but left untreated. The disease ravaged his mind, amplifying his paranoia and delusions, but even as his mental state deteriorated, his visions of the men he had ordered killed remained vivid. He would often sit in his cell, muttering apologies to no one in particular, as if seeking forgiveness from ghosts only he could see. By the time Capone was released in 1939 due to his failing health, he was a shadow of his former self. The once feared mob boss was reduced to a frail, paranoid man, haunted by the specters of his past. He retired to his estate in Palm Island, Florida, where his condition worsened. Family members and caretakers reported hearing him call out in the middle of the night, pleading with his unseen figures to leave him alone. One chilling account came from a nurse who claimed she found Capone sitting alone in his study, staring at an empty chair. When she asked if he needed anything, he whispered, "They're all here, all of them, watching me." Capone died in 1947, but even in his final days, he seemed unable to escape the ghosts of the massacre. Some say his death was a release, a way to finally escape the torment he had endured for years. Others believe the men he ordered killed had claimed their revenge, dragging him into the afterlife to face judgment for his sins. The legacy of Al Capone is one of power, greed, and violence. But it is also a cautionary tale, a reminder that no empire built on blood can last forever, and that even the most ruthless men cannot escape the consequences of their actions. Today, the site of the massacre is a parking lot. The garage was torn down in 1967, but the ghosts remain. Visitors claim to feel an unshakable dread as if they're being watched. Dogs refuse to enter, barking at something unseen. Every Valentine's Day, the air grows heavy. Some say they hear whispers, the faint sound of men pleading for their lives. Others report cold hands brushing their shoulders, the chill of death lingering long after they've left. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is more than a historical event. It's a haunting, a reminder that violence leaves scars, not just on the living, but on the very fabric of the world. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre left a permanent stain on Chicago, its echoes rippling far beyond the city limits. The sight of 7 men gunned down in a cold garage became a symbol of the Prohibition-era's violence, a moment that defined the brutality of organized crime. But the massacre's legacy did not end with the deaths of its victims, or the eventual downfall of Al Capone. It seeped into the cultural consciousness, a haunting reminder of the cost of greed and power. After the massacre, Chicago became a city gripped by fear. For the public, the slaughter was a stark revelation of the depths to which men like Capone would sink to maintain their empires. Though violence was no stranger to the city, the sheer cold-bloodedness of the massacre was different. It wasn't a targeted killing in a dark alley or a drive-by shooting under the cover of night. It was an execution, a message sent with blood and bullets. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. Newspapers plastered images of the crime scene across their front pages. The bodies of Moran's men slumped lifelessly against the bullet-riddled wall. Editorials decried the lawlessness of the city, demanding action from the authorities. The press dubbed it St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a grimly ironic moniker that juxtaposed the holiday's theme of love and romance with the darkest moments in Chicago's history. The massacre forced the federal government to take notice. For years, organized crime had flourished, with law enforcement either complicit or powerless to stop it. But the massacre marked a turning point. President Herbert Hoover, armed by the public outrage, instructed federal agents to target Capone with renewed vigor. Within 2 years, Capone was behind bars for tax evasion, and the seeds of his empire began to wither. Yet, even as the authorities made strides to dismantle the mob, the massacre's shadow continued to loom. The garage on North Clark Street became a grim attraction, with morbid curiosity drawing locals and tourists alike to the site. Some visitors left flowers or lit candles, treating the location like a shrine. Others came simply to gawk, fascinated by the violence that had unfolded within its walls. By the 1940s, the garage had become too notorious to remain. The property was sold and the building was demolished in 1967, leaving behind only the memory of what had occurred there. The bricks from the infamous wall, still pocked with bullet holes, were salvaged and sold to collectors, their morbid history adding to their value. Some of these bricks eventually found their way to a Las Vegas casino, where they were displayed behind glass as a macabre reminder of Chicago's bloody past. But the legacy of the massacre extended beyond the physical site. It became a story told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale of hubris and violence. Writers, filmmakers, and historians latched onto the event, weaving it into the mythology of America's criminal underworld, painting vivid pictures of a time when Tommy guns ruled the streets and the line between hero and villain was blurred. Yet for all its notoriety, the massacre also left an emotional scar on Chicago's residents. For the families of the victims, the event was a personal tragedy, one that left wounds that never fully healed. For the city's neighborhoods, it was a reminder of how easily violence could erupt, tearing apart the fragile fabric of their communities. Over time, the massacre took on a near mythic quality. Some claimed the site was cursed, that the violence of that day had imprinted itself on the land. Others saw it as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and greed, a warning to future generations. In the end, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was more than just a moment of violence. It was a reflection of an era, a time when the thirst for power outweighed human life, and the streets of Chicago were painted red with the consequences. It served as both a grim chapter in the history of organized crime and a haunting reminder that even the most powerful empires are built on fragile foundations. Though nearly a century has passed since that fateful day, its story remains etched in the annals of history. It is a tale of ambition, betrayal, and blood, a chilling testament to the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men and the price paid for pursuing power at any cost. And so, my friends, we leave our tale of love and loss. Though I suppose the love part is debatable. Remember, as you exchange your chocolates and roses, that Valentine's Day is not always so sweet. Sometimes it comes with bullets instead of bows. But don't let that frighten you. After all, it's not as if you're planning a massacre. Are you? Good night.